Travis Luther is an MSU Denver alumnus and founder of Luther Media LLC. He's an entrepreneur, an author, a former adjunct professor, and a former frontman of the band Ultrafind. He served as the entrepreneur in residence at CU Denver and as the president of the Entrepreneurs Organization of Colorado. Travis is also a current member of the MSU Denver Alumni Board of Directors and Foundation Board. Is that right, Travis?
My term just ended, so I can't claim that anymore.
Okay.
But I did my time.
Despite that term ending, he still has had a really diverse career, and that has included founding multiple successful companies and publishing his book, The Fun Side of the Wall. Is that right?
That's right.
And it's an Amazon bestseller about retirees seeking better lives abroad. So without further ado, I'm going to highlight you and go off camera so I'm not distracting anyone, but know that I'm here to support. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to hit me up in the chat. And
Ruby, don't go off camera, then I'll be the only one on camera.
Okay, I'll quietly be on camera smiling while Travis takes the reins. So thanks so much, Travis, for being here.
Yeah, of course, of course. So do you have some questions you want to start with, or are we going to take some questions from the panel, or what would you like to do?
Well, do you think that you could kind of start in with some stories while that way I can look at the chat and the people coming in, I have to allow them in. And then after you set up some of your story, I'll ask you some questions.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm going to kind of start with my childhood because as Ruby said, I've launched and sold a number of businesses recently. And so over the last 3 years, I've got some time to return to my academic studies, which have largely looked at the link between childhood trauma and entrepreneurship. And so I've been going around speaking all over the country and some little parts of the world about the relationship between people who have suffered childhood trauma and successful entrepreneurship later in their life. And so I generally start my story of entrepreneurship with my childhood. My mother got pregnant with me when she was 15, and by the time she was 19, she was a single mom of 3 boys. We were very poor. We lived in rural Washington, in a little town of about 13 people. My father did not come because my parents separated very early. And my father was also a drug addict and alcoholic, and so he was just not available to us in that role. But because of that, I developed this strong need to have some control in my life and try and dictate terms as best I could, as best as a kid could. And certainly financially, that was, one of the areas that I wanted to dictate my own terms, because we were on food stamps and government cheese, and there were just things that a young boy wants, like baseball cards and bicycles and Nikes and things of that nature. So I would say by the time I was in 3rd grade, I was I had a couple paper routes. I was selling newspaper subscriptions to make my paper routes even more robust so I could make even more money from delivering even more papers. I would do things like recycle aluminum from the neighborhood and get my friends to go dumpster diving, and we would find cans and bottles and newspaper and recycle that for money. I even had a little scheme where I was raising mice to sell to the pet store as feeder mice for the snakes. which was probably my most profitable grade school business. But my mother struggled with some mental health issues for sure. And as we got into, including elementary school, junior high, and high school, we were turned over to different relatives, turned over to foster care, and then eventually, a couple weeks before my 16th birthday, I decided just to move out on my own and attempt to start my own life. Unfortunately, because I had the care and responsibility for my 2 younger brothers as well, I dropped out of the 10th grade and lied about my age and just started working full time, most notably cleaning hotel rooms. But I always had this desire to be an entrepreneur. Like I said, a lot of that came from this need to try and find a place where I could control my life and control my finances. And so by the time I was 16, a friend of mine and I had opened a skateboard and snowboard shop. We were in a college town, and so I was very into skateboarding. So was my friend. He had some bonds that his mom had bought him a long time ago to go to college. And he convinced her somehow to let him cash some of those out so he and I could start the skateboard and snowboard shop. Because we were in a college town, we had a lot of the snow stuff on consignment, and so college students would come in and put their used gear on consignment. And then one night, probably about 6 months into that, somebody broke in and stole everything. And so we had no idea what we were doing. I think I had just turned 17 years old. Again, I had already been living on my own for about a year and a half and lying about my age. And as these things go, I was sued. I was sued by the people who had their stuff on consignment. So by the time I was 17, I was already the defendant in a lawsuit. I went to court. I never mentioned that I was a minor. I never tried to put it on my mom. I just took my lumps and got my judgments. And then I think for the next couple of years, I worked in a grocery store paying off these garnishments that came as a result of the lawsuits. But it did not deter me. And me and the same guy, my same knucklehead friend, decided that when the coffee shop in our town closed, which had been kind of the center social hub of our lives, that we would be the ones to open up a new one. And so, somewhat ironically, that pet store that I talked about that I used to sell the mice to became vacated, and we took over that space and remodeled it to be a coffee shop, which was pretty disgusting. As you can imagine, there was some pretty nasty stuff living inside the walls there, and stuff. Well, not even living, also dead. But we cleaned that stuff out, and we opened up a coffee shop. And for that first year, we were very successful. In fact, we bought a second drive-through, and then things kind of fell apart. From there, we definitely got in over our heads with debt and didn't really understand what we were doing, and so that caused a little break in my entrepreneurship journey. Although I did manage to turn those coffee shops over to a woman who had some drive-throughs in the area. And so I'm proud to say that it's still there, even after all these years. So whenever I go home, I'm able to go home and see the coffee shop I started down on Main Street. So that's my early life. When I eventually at some point I decided to return to school. I got my GED. I decided to go to college. I went to college for a few years. I ended up actually having a pretty successful music career that took me out of college for a few years, and was in a couple signed bands and toured all over the country playing music. And then it was at the point that I was about maybe 23 or 24 years old, I decided I probably did need to think about a future after music. And so I came to Denver because a friend of mine had just moved here to get his PhD, and he said, "Why don't you come check it out?" And the University of Colorado Denver had a music business program that I thought would be a good precursor to law school. But after a semester there, I realized they weren't going to give me residency or transfer a lot of my credits. So I did like a lot of people did. I walked on over to MSU. I said, "Here's my situation. What would it look like if I transferred here?" And they made it super easy and super awesome for me. And so, yeah, I transferred and eventually finished here. But while I was going to school at MSU, I worked as a valet at night in Cherry Creek parking cars. And while I was down there parking cars, I'm handing out these big valet tickets to all these really rich people. And I got this idea like, hey, I wonder if I could sell advertising on these valet tickets. Because here I am putting these things right in the hands of people who have tons of money. And so I talked to the owner of my valet company, and he said, "Sure, you can try, but it's never going to work." And I said, "Okay, if you don't think it's ever going to work, do you mind if I try and coordinate this with every other valet company in the city so that I can have hand out even more tickets?" And he said, "Do whatever you want." So I did that. I called the other valet companies, and I basically made this deal. I said, I'm gonna make these advertising tickets. If you agree to be a partner with me, I'm gonna give you tickets for free, which you might think is cheap, but they have variable numbers on them and stuff, so they're not super cheap, but they're not terribly expensive. And I said, I'm gonna give you free valet tickets, and then I'm also gonna pay you 1 penny each every time you use one. And so everybody was in agreement. And within 2 weeks of being able to launch, I had my first client, which was Mercedes-Benz of Westminster, which is now some other Mercedes-Benz, I don't know. But that was probably the quickest, fastest success I had ever had in my life. And if I try and explain it, it kind of comes down to I'd learned a lot of lessons from those previous failures on how to organize a business and most importantly, how to solve a problem. And the problem I was solving with valet ads was, how do you get very personalized messages to the educated and affluent? And that's why like Mercedes-Benz was such a great fit. After that, the Nuggets became my client, the Avalanche, the whole Pepsi Center in general, luxury real estate builders and other car places. And so that business started to expand nationally. And I was learning a lot about online marketing because this was, in 2004, 2005, right, as kind of the internet and search engine optimization and web development was becoming a little more mainstream. In an attempt to learn how to grow my company, I started trying to learn about web marketing and web design and graphic design. And it was at that time that I met my wife, who is a lawyer, and she was on a message board for her trial lawyers organization, and people were always posting on there, do you have anyone you know who could help me with a website or a brochure or marketing? And she would say, do you want to talk to these people? And I said, sure, send them my way. And very quickly, I realized that there was a niche for helping attorneys with their digital needs, web design, brochure design, and eventually even going to trial and helping them with television monitors and overhead projectors and all of that stuff. And so just like that success with valet ads, I looked to the guy who was working for me at valet ads as a graphic designer. I said, look, this is what we're going to do, Derek. We're going to make a company called Lawfather, and we're going to pretend that all we do is just work with lawyers, and it'll be great. It'll be this like little side project. But eventually, very quickly, not eventually, it became the main project and did way more revenue and way more business than anything that I'd done before, including valet ads. It was also about this time that I had graduated from MSU, and I had entered the master's program of sociology back at UCD. And I really enjoyed sociology. In fact, I got into sociology because it was just a requirement I had to take to finish my degree at MSU. But I fell in love with the concepts and the ideas. And I think if you go back to the earlier part of my story where I was talking about my own upbringing and the challenges with it, it was really sociology that helped me be able to articulate why my family ended up in the situations that were in and what the societal structures around us, how they either hurt or improved our situation. And I just found it fascinating. And so by the time I graduated MSU, I felt like I wasn't done with sociology. So I applied into the master's program at UCD. I got a year and a half through that, and somebody invited me to join the PhD program upstairs in public affairs. And so I left the sociology department, went to the PhD department, and then I remember there was almost winter break, right? The winter finals are coming. I'm at my desk. I have a line of employees who need stuff for me. I have the phone ringing off the hook with customers who want something from me, and I have this 50-page paper due about some topic, God knows what. And I just thought to myself, Travis, you have to make a decision here about whether you're going to pursue academics or you're going to pursue business. And you really have to go with your gut and what you love. And I loved them both so much, but I really enjoyed being an entrepreneur much more. And so I made the decision to withdraw from the PhD program, went back to the sociology department, said, hey, I'm back. Can I finish my master's? They said yes. And then I pursued Lawfather full time. So from there, we spun a software product out of that company that is a timeline software for lawyers so that they could make their own interactive presentations for trial called Trialline. And I sold that company about 2 years ago. And I also, during that time, started a pillow company called Queen Anne Pillow Company because I was having back problems too. And probably from crawling around all those courtrooms, setting up television monitors, and from my 8 years of coaching Little League baseball and running all over the field, bending over to pick up balls. But I eventually had two surgeries, back surgeries, before I was even 40 years old. And so I wanted to know, was there a pillow out there that can help with back pain? Because I heard a lot of ads about pillows that can help with neck pain. I eventually figured out there was no pillow for back pain and that pillows are really, really different. And it was really hard to understand the differences between pillows and why one costs $4, but the other costs $400. And so I decided if I could launch a pillow company with a focus on educating consumers about the differences between pillows and pillow fill and how they perform and helping them pick a better pillow for themselves, that I could be pretty successful. And it turned out that was a good bet as well. And so I owned that company for 8 years. And then we eventually sold it just a little over 3 years ago. So that kind of gets you up to speed. When you sell a business, you enter into what's called a non-compete. And so basically they say, hey, all of these areas that you have expertise in, you can no longer work in or start a business. And so kind of for the last 3 years, yeah, I've been under these non-competes. So I haven't really been able to own a business or start a business. But what I have been able to do is return to some of those academic pursuits that I really loved, especially in my practice of sociology. And so that's when I started doing the work on the relationship between childhood trauma and successful entrepreneurship, giving those talks and working on a book about that. But the other thing I did is I spent the last year interviewing people with terminal illness to gather their last bits of wisdom and advice before they leave this world. And I was inspired to do that by a really good friend of mine who got a stage 4 cancer diagnosis a year ago, December. And he had also, my father did eventually die. I don't think I put that in the story, but when I was a teenager, he died from his addiction. And this friend of mine, George, had also lost his father as a teenager. And so when I found out about George's diagnosis, I called him to check in on him. And I said, one thing I always regretted was never talking to my dad much about what he thought of life while he was in hospice. And the truth is I had taken care of him up until that point where I couldn't take care of him anymore and then put him in hospice. But after that, I was very angry. I had taken care of him and my 2 younger brothers. And I just, I just was mad at him. And it wasn't somebody that I wanted to continue to talk to. But as I got older and became a father myself, I started to regret that and started to wonder what advice and counsel he may have given me at the end of his life. And so when George had his diagnosis, we talked about that, about regrets, about losing our fathers as teenagers and some of the unknowns about that. And I said, I've always been thinking about this project of interviewing people who are dying to try and get their last little bits of wisdom and advice. And what would you think about that? And do you think it's too morbid or too self-serving? And he said, no, I think it's a great idea. And I'd love to be your first interview. And so kind of with George's blessing and permission, I set off over the last year doing that work. And unfortunately, George did pass away a couple of months ago, but through his inspiration, I've collected a whole bunch of interviews and testimony and life lessons. And so that is also another book that I'm working on when I can. So yeah, that's what life has kind of looked like.
Travis, that was incredible. And I feel like the questions that I have prepared for you, I kind of want to start in the deeper parts of your work and work backwards into high level business strategy. Does that
Sure.
make sense? I just feel like pivoting to what's your marketing stragy kind of feels out of depth.
Sure.
But thinking about experiencing instability as a child, I'm thinking about how do you think childhood adversity has shaped your leadership style, or have you noticed a pattern in yourself or other entrepreneurs? Can you share some of that insight with us?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that a rough childhood do to a young man's behavior that serve him very well in early entrepreneurship. For example, feeling like you're the only one who can get anything done, right? And so you kind of take charge and you do things. Number two, you have no accountability in the situation I did. So there was never any parent or mentor group telling me not to do anything or that I was, screwing my life up. I, like many children who have gone through chronic trauma, had a high need for recognition, right? And so that high need for recognition also led me to entrepreneurship, because I liked to hear that people were proud of me or they were impressed by the things that I did. So early on, those kind of behaviors did serve me well. As you get older and your enterprise becomes more bigger with more people and more complicated, those things don't serve you well anymore. I think anybody who's worked in a management situation who has tried to do everything on their own learns pretty quickly that that's a good way to screw up your team and screw up your business. And so I think I had to spend some time trying to discern like what of my reactions were because of my childhood and what of my reactions were really because I had problems in a business. And so that takes a lot longer for folks like me, I think, to discern. We have a lot of shame. I mean, shame is a big part of childhood trauma. And sometimes that shame translates to like not wanting to deal with problems because you don't want to hear anymore that you've made a mistake or that you're somehow bad. And so I definitely had developed a pattern of avoidance that I wish I had recognized a lot sooner that would have allowed me to address bigger challenges head on and get them solved faster. Does that kind of answer what you're asking?
Yeah, totally. I think kind of, playing off of that answer, you mentioned some of the struggles that can accompany being an entrepreneur and also having some, trauma. And I think even if you don't have a significant childhood of trauma, everyone has trauma, right? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs also experience a lot of imposter syndrome and burnout. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with things like that if you have, and do you believe that, our past kind of plays a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, I do, as I do this work that I've been talking about, going around and speaking and stuff. I mean, I talk about imposter syndrome right off the bat. And in terms of my background, a lot of that imposter syndrome has to do with being very cautious to reward yourself and say that you've done anything good. Regardless of, on the other hand, where you say, hey, I need a lot of attention and congratulations, deep down inside, you always wonder, or you always say to yourself, well, if people really knew me, right, they'd know that I'm a faker and I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm just trying to get through it. So, but that doesn't just extend to people who have suffered trauma. I think imposter syndrome is actually in a lot of people, right, or a lot of morally grounded people, because as we grow, we're kind of taught not to toot our horn too much and not to be too aggressive about how great we are and like not to celebrate ourselves too much. And so I think a pattern of that over and over, especially depending on what your family situation is like, can cause you to second guess whether or not the success that you're having is because you're really good or just because you're lucky. And a lot of times the answer for people with imposter syndrome is they think that they are just lucky and they don't believe that the activity of their lives is what has caused them to be good. And this is kind of the lesson I like to give to everybody is like, I love entrepreneurship and I love business and I love capitalism. And the reason that I do is because the market doesn't care, right? The market doesn't know if you're a minority or a woman or a foreigner or an AI chatbot or whatever. The market only knows if your company delivers on its promise to like solve a problem, right? And that's like really empowering for people like me who have never felt power or control in their lives, is that I create these companies. They're not called Travis Luther Timeline and they're not called Travis Luther Pillow or anything like that, right? They are these seemingly faceless companies that have to go out into the market and compete with other companies and have to solve problems better than other companies. And the buyer, generally, although they may say at some point, oh, I love to buy from women-owned businesses or businesses that buy one, give one, that's largely what you say after you make a purchase to kind of help justify it. If those shoes aren't comfortable, I often use Tom's as an example. If Tom's shoes weren't so comfortable and didn't look so cool, nobody would buy them because they give a pair to kids in Africa. If you buy a pair, that's just not a good enough problem to solve, right? People buy them because they're so great, so comfortable, and so cool. And then they tell their friends, oh, and did you know that Tom's also has this great program where you buy a pair of shoes and they give a pair of shoes to these kids in Africa. So that's what I really mean by like these faceless companies that have to solve problems. Like, even though we do talk about the good work that businesses do, if the business can't be successful on its own, if it can't be the best pillow company in the world, if it can't be the best software company in the world, it's not going to be successful. And in that, I find a lot of peace and comfort. I really do, because I feel like everybody has a chance to be able to go out and do that. And so bringing this full circle back to imposter syndrome, sometimes it's a lot easier than you think, right? Sometimes, like if you really start a business and you grow a business from a place of solving a problem that you know exists and that's so painful somebody will pay you to fix it, then the ease of having success and the time that it takes is much shorter than you might realize. And so you could be like me, where when I tell the story about valet ads before, I say that in the year before that, when I came to Denver, I had filled out my taxes and I had total income that year of, I think it was like $9,100. Okay. And the following year, because of all the things I had learned in business and how I had figured out that you have to solve problems and blah, 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 my first commission check, not even the total of the sale, but my first commission check with the Mercedes Benz, I think the sale was like $20,000 or something like that. And the money I made in profit was 14,000 some odd dollars. I mean, that in one transaction, I had made more money than I'd made in the previous year. And then that happened over and over and over again. So, yeah, do you think there was a little imposter syndrome? Yeah, I mean, there was like, oh shucks, what am I doing? And when is, and then this is the other thing that happens when you have chronic childhood traumas. Then you start to think not only, oh, does anyone know what I've got here, but also this is too good to be true. Everything always fails for me. Something's going to happen. The rug's going to be pulled out from underneath me, blah, 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 blah. And then you just start living in this like, paranoid state of fear, that because you can't explain why you were successful, then it must be luck. Thus, it must be apt to be taken away from you at any time.
I call it hurt syndrome. If you've ever listened to the Nine Inch Nails song or the Johnny Cash version,
Of course.
there's yeah, I mean it's that resonates with me in understanding how the rug can be pulled out from under you, and it will be at some time. But I really appreciate this insight. And I'm thinking about what you said about identifying the markets, the products, solving the problems. And I'm wondering, how do you identify market gaps or business opportunities before others do? Or is that the strategy?
Well, there is definitely a first to market advantage, like if you've figured out a way to solve a problem. But what I would tell my students when I taught in the entrepreneurship department at MSU is the same thing I would tell all of you. I mean, if you're thinking about starting a business and you feel like you're an entrepreneur, you're called to entrepreneurship, but then you're like step two, you're like, but I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. Like, I don't know what kind of business I want to get into. Then what I always recommend is just look at your life from a little bit of distance and ask yourself, where do you get frustrated and what do you get frustrated about? Like, what are the problems that you have in your own life, right? I don't have elderly parents, but maybe like you have elderly parents and your mom can't stop slipping in the shower, right? That's a real problem. Okay, then I ask myself, do I think that's a problem for other people as well? And do a little research and see if it is. Has anybody solved that problem? Maybe they have tried, maybe they have like half a thing figured out, but maybe they haven't. And so that is like a real problem that people would pay money to solve. So then you can go start to develop some technology or ideas about how to solve it. But the best businesses in my life came from pain, right? Problems and pain that I was having in my life. Like my back pain is a great example of that. And the businesses that I had before that weren't successful, the skateboard and snowboard shop and the coffee shops and some other things that I did, they were formed because I was interested in those things. But no one ever asked me to start those businesses. And I never could have identified what the problem was that they solved. It was just stuff I was personally interested in. And that's why I always kind of caution people, you hear this saying, like, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life, right? But if you solve a problem that you love, that's really when you never work a day in your life. But pursuing a passion project because you think it's awesome and you enjoy doing it isn't always going to translate into an amazing or successful business. Quite often, it ends up being a little side project that costs your household a lot of money that you keep trying to do for years and years and years. And eventually you have to stop because there's just not enough demand there. The problem does not hurt enough people as badly as whatever it is that you're doing or charging for.
Great. This actually is a perfect segue to my next question is, have you ever had to make like a controversial business decision? And if you did, how did you handle the fallout?
Hmm. I can't really think of a controversial business decision. I do remember during COVID when the My Pillow guy, Mike Lindell, kind of went bonkers. um, he kind of went bonkers and he had gotten banned from Facebook or something. And then people started coming after me and my company, making all kinds of weird claims that I was somehow responsible for it because I was benefiting from it. And whatever was going on, I really wasn't paying that much attention to, and certainly I didn't have anything to do with it. Facebook never calls me and asks me my opinion on it, right? So, but I did remember diving into it, and I was like, okay. I mean, I'm not aligned with Mike Lindell at all on any of whatever he's spouting, right? And so, like, if you want to draw a line in the sand, I mean, this is kind of a business strategy too. If you want to draw a line in the sand, you can also through your marketing say this is what we are not, right? And so what Queen Anne Pillow is not, I remember making this graphic of a dumpster fire with Mike Lindell holding his pillow, and I'm saying, he wanted to overthrow the government or whatever the hell he wanted to do, and whatever. And I said the only thing Queen Anne wants is a sleep revolution. We don't want a government revolution. We're not trying to do anything like that. So we did kind of draw a line in the sand. And I remember for a month there, it was a lot of fun, and I loved bantering with people on social. And I think in some respect, we did sell some more pillows, but that's probably the closest I came to exposing myself personally and kind of putting myself in front of the business, if you will.
I love it. What a fun marketing strategy.
Yeah.
I actually have a question in the chat that I'm going to read
Sure.
to you. What advice would you give to new entrepreneurs trying to get their business off the ground, especially when they have low financial means and limited marketing funding?
Yeah, get a job. That's what I tell everybody. I mean, because I mean that's where I was, and these are realities, right? I mean, like not everyone's getting funded, and not everyone has a great idea that's worth funding, and then not every idea is a kind of idea that gets funded. And what I mean by that is generally the people who are going to make big investments in your company are looking for big companies that are eventually going to have big exits. And so your presentation has to be about how many millions of products you're going to sell or millions of people you're going to affect. And when you're starting, that just might not be the thing that you're interested in, right? Like a small chain of coffee shops is probably never going to get an investor because it just isn't going to make enough money to get the kind of returns that they want for the kind of risk that they put their money at. And so I always told my students, get a job, in those in that area if you can, where you want to have your business, and learn as much as you can, save as much money as you can, but kind of take the resources of those companies to educate you and teach you about not only how to be in that business, but where are they failing, and keep your little book of pain points and problems. Like, what do I know I could do better? And that's where a lot of entrepreneurs start, actually, is from their jobs. And they're in a position where they get frustrated by a process or a product, and they're the ones having to deal with the complaints or fixing stuff. And they go, I just know I could do this better. Right. And so at that point, they know where there's a problem. They already know people pay for it because that's why they have the job, pay to fix it. And then they can leave from there. But the best kind of job you can have, right, is like this job that I had as a valet at night, because um, I had to park a car maybe every 15 or 20 minutes, but the rest of the time I could sit there working on my business idea. I could sit there studying for school. I often joke to my friends, if I could go back and do it again, like the best job ever would be that person who works in the parking booth at the parking garage at the Tivoli, right? Because you get this like one rush every 15 minutes when the hour is over, and the rest of the 45 minutes you could sit there like working on your ideas and stuff, but like meanwhile you're getting paid. But some things I'll kind of caution you on as you develop that business is if you do take investment, right, generally that comes with a cost, and that cost is equity. And so if somebody says, hey, Ruby, I love your idea, I want to buy in, they're not just giving you the money, they're saying, I also own 25% of this. And so the earlier you are in your business, when you take that investment, generally the more equity you're going to give up, right? And you really want to protect that equity. And so you need to do things like create a financial plan and get credit cards and figure out what stuff is going to cost and how you're going to use that credit to the best of your ability. But don't do it on a whim. Again, I go back to the problem solving thing. This is where all entrepreneurs make a mistake. It's the first thing they think they do is because I love painting, I'm going to open a paint studio, right? Well, that doesn't solve a problem. There's already plenty of paint studios, right? And then two, like whatever problem I think I'm going to solve, it's only a problem for me, and they don't do the research to find out if it's a problem for the market, and it's the market who's going to make the purchase. So when you're confident you've got both a real problem and a market that's going to buy it, then you should have no fear about running up those credit cards. I know. I mean, I never took investment for any of my companies. The company I'm working on right now is the first company that I've ever taken investment on. But I know what it means to bootstrap and to use credit and to use savings and to take risks. And but at the end, when I sold those companies, I didn't have to split it up with very many people.
That's really exciting. And I am so happy that people are hearing about these successful companies and also the companies that weren't so successful, because that's reality, right?
Mhm.
We're getting some more questions in the chat, so I'm just gonna ask another one. When you are learning the ins and outs of a new company like the pillow company, where do you turn in order to start learning facts about the product that are selling or making?
The internet. I mean, I, you know, I, I mean, I've learned so much on YouTube. I mean, I have a pretty good sense of manufacturing now and textile manufacturing and all sorts of stuff. But I would tell you that I largely learned it, from YouTube and from the internet and from reading. And, I bought, a lot of books, like old textbooks on, different obscure topics. Like you're not really going to learn textile. You're not going to buy a textiles book at Barnes and Noble per se, right? You might buy like one on pretty wallpapers and different, stuff like that. But so yeah, like finding like old textbooks on Amazon is like a really great way to get some really specific knowledge. And then trying to find people in the industry and ask them. It's not very often that somebody is interested in pillows and reaches out to me to learn about the pillow business, right? So when somebody does, I'm like really excited because I feel special. So there's a lot of people like that out there, like me, who have low self-esteem and really want people to make them feel special. That if you reach out to them and they're working in an industry that you have some interest in starting a business in, they'll actually be more excited to help you than you might imagine.
I give that advice to people often, that reaching out to someone to ask them, can you tell me your story and tell me about something you're interested in? They're really likely to say yes, because thinking about people like to talk about themselves. I know if you were to ask me right now, what are you passionate about? I would probably talk for 20 minutes. So it's low hanging fruit, right? To ask people about what they're really interested in and how they got there and themselves and their passions. So in case you're an introvert and you are a little scared of those sort of things, don't be. People really kind of thrive in that space of talking about themselves.
Yeah, and I
No,
think there's another like just misconception. I'll just say this quickly that
yeah.
everyone is a competitor, right? And really, as you get a little more mature in the business world, it's not always like that. It's not always just because you call somebody in a similar industry that you think that they're going to ignore you or that they're a competitor. You'll just find that people are much more willing to help, especially if you could use the caveat that you're a college student. But they're really much more willing to help than you might imagine.
Thank you. I have another question, and it's coming from Alyssa, and it says, identifying a need and resolving them is a great way to find businesses to begin. How do you decide when your run is over with the business that you began and put so much into?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different reasons that, that I've ended businesses or sold businesses. Um, you know, After moving to Denver, it was really because the opportunities got better. Valet Ads was a great business, but then Lawfather, the digital agency for lawyers, turned out to be an even greater business, right? And so, valet ads was something that I continued to kind of operate in my back pocket, meaning I had a group of clients that still wanted to do business and I didn't have to sell to. And so I would, gladly take checks and run programs when I could. but Law Father was really, I could see the writing on the wall. This was going to be a multi-million-dollar company, and we really had a niche, and we had a lot more people with problems, and that had a lot more money, and so it was a lot more attractive to me. But let's pretend that, here's kind of some of the unforeseen things. Let's pretend that I hadn't, married a lawyer and gotten into legal tech and I continued with Valet Ads. The reason Valet Ads doesn't really exist today is because of like Lyft and Uber, right? And so as soon as those services came out, the calls for that business declined dramatically, and the calls that I did receive, I had to be more honest with, because now way fewer people were valeting anymore. And so it's kind of like Blockbuster, right? Like went the way of the dinosaur because of Netflix, and Valet Ads largely went the way of the dinosaur because of Uber and Lyft. So sometimes there are just these technology innovations that kind of sneak up on you. And if that was my only business, this would be more of a sad story than a good story. With regard to the pillow company, I had a partner and who was my father-in-law, and the business was growing very fast, and it needed more and more capital and more partners. And he and I, we were great partners, but I don't know that we ever really got an agreement about what the future was going to look like, and who was going to be responsible for the finances and the work, and how big of a team we wanted to hire. And with all due respect to him, I mean, it was always kind of a side project, and it was something he wanted to do in his retirement. He was not looking to get back into a full-time job and run a multi-million-dollar company. So when COVID hit, our business really grew too. I mean, it was always a good business, but then when everybody got stuck in their houses and they started replacing all their bedding, they replaced a lot of it with Queen Anne pillow. And so we could look at our financial trajectory too and say, man, if we did put this on the market, this would be a good time for us to sell, because our revenue and our nets are so high. And so it was kind of like a strategic decision too, about sunsetting, his role in the business at a time when we could get a lot of money for it. And so that's why we did that. And then with Trialline, it was kind of like another case of, the business had good revenue, but it was really expensive to operate. So when you have a software business, it needs constant updating. It needs a constant tech team. It's never done. So I will just warn you all about that. If you're thinking about starting a software product, it's not like, oh, I'm going to pay $20,000 and then my app will be done. It is nonstop, and it is way more expensive to own and operate than it is profitable in those first couple of years. And so, but again, over COVID, with people doing more virtual trial stuff, the sales in our customer base also grew. And I felt like, okay, this is a good time for me to recoup my investment and take some products. And I don't really want to be responsible for the next phase and fundraising and how much bigger the software development team is going to be. And by that time, I had spent 15 or 18 years in legal, and I was ready for a change. And that was it. I mean, I probably could still own that company and make nice monthly revenue from it, but I just felt, I had sold the pillow company. I had never dreamed of being in legal. It wasn't like a big dream of mine. It worked out very well for me and my family, but I was just ready to do something else.
Thank you, Travis. The next question is, you mentioned that a couple of your first ventures didn't work out the way you wanted. And what are a few of the key lessons that you learned from the mistakes that made your future ventures successful?
Yeah, the first one I'll always say is cost of goods. And if you've been a student of mine, or, heard me on other entrepreneurship related podcasts, I always say, like, this is the thing I did not understand. And it is always the first thing I teach in a business class or entrepreneurship class. And I mean cost of understanding exactly what it costs for you to create something and give it to somebody. And I use the example of the coffee company. I never knew, ever, ever, ever in that entire time that I owned it, how much it cost me to make a latte and give it to someone. My entire pricing structure was based on what I thought Starbucks charged. And then I thought if I charge a little bit less, then that would make me compete with Starbucks. And that's how I was going to do my pricing. So I did not know how much the milk cost. And then when you really start to break it down, right, there's a lot of costs. So I have the 2 ounces of espresso. I have the 8 ounces of milk. I have the cup. I have the sleeve, I have the lid, I have the little red straws. I also need to know how many Equal or Splenda or sugar people are going to put in it, right? Like, and then somebody's going to take the cup carrier too, and that costs something. So what I really encourage people to understand is, what does it cost to make this product, right? How much electricity do you think it costs to fire up that machine and make 100 lattes or whatever, and then divide that by 100, right? And then you know that you have 33 cents in energy costs associated with every coffee. Every little thing that you can find, right? When we talk about shoes, you have the leather, the sole, but then you also have the shoelaces. You have the little plastic caps that go on the end of the shoelaces. You have the box, but not just the box, but the tissue paper that the shoes are wrapped in. You need to know every little thing that goes into your cost of goods so that you can price your products appropriately and make sure that every time one of them leaves your warehouse or your office, that you're actually making a profit on it. And that includes services too. So if you're a graphic designer, it's the same thing. How long does it take me to do a brochure? How long does it take me to do a poster? Right? Like who do I have to partner with to do that? All that stuff. Like, you really need to understand it.
I have another question in the chat. It's from Chelsea. How do you adopt an entrepreneur mindset, especially coming from a worker mindset? I've spoken to other entrepreneurs and they can quickly come up with new business ideas and identify areas that generate money. Meanwhile, I struggle to come up with my own business.
Mm. Well, I mean, if it's going back to the question about business generation, then I go back to the problems thing. But I would also warn you, Chelsea. I don't know. I don't know your entrepreneur friends or how successful they are, but a lot of us think we have a lot of great ideas too that we haven't really fleshed out, and probably fleshed them out, their shit. So be real careful about who you're getting advice from, and also real careful about who you consider an entrepreneur, because somebody who launches an app on the best places to buy gum may own a business that tells you where to buy gum on an app, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily a successful business. So just be kind of careful about that. I don't know if that really answered your question, but let me think about this. Entrepreneurship is a mindset. It definitely is a mindset. And it's one that takes practice. And I think if you're coming out of a business setting, you have a couple things that surround you, right? And number one is this idea of safety. You've gone to college or whatever, you've developed a career, and you have a very predictable path. In general, you get reviewed every so often, you get raises every so often, and things feel very kind of normal and safe and predictable, and which is the total opposite of entrepreneurship. Until entrepreneurship can become all those things, but it takes time, right? And no business, no new business is predictable and safe. But they do eventually become that. I owned my companies for 8 years and 18 years, and so early on, I never would have imagined that it would become that, but I developed practices and operational guides that made it predictable and safe. But you have to practice having some level of risk tolerance, because it is not going to go how you think it's going to go. It's not going to be as successful as fast as you think it's going to be. And it is going to present challenges to you that you never would have imagined. But it's also going to present benefits to you that you never would have imagined. And those are like the trade-offs, the freedom, right? The ability to dictate your own schedule. For me, it was always the time with my kids. I knew I had made it when I had said to my staff, I won't be in until after 9, and every day I leave at 2:30, because my priority is to get up with my sons, make them breakfast, make them lunch, get them out the door, and then to be there at school when they're done. And so that's what entrepreneurship gave to me, and that was well worth the risk and the fear and the anxiety around whether or not I was going to be successful. But you do have to practice this in like little baby steps, like turning over safety, taking chances, getting comfortable with the unknown. And you probably do that in a lot of other areas of your life that you may not realize. I mean, making the decision to get married or have kids is one of those where you're stepping into the unknown, but you do it because you know it's all going to work out. You have faith or whatever it is that carries you through, and entrepreneurship is no different. You have to believe in what you're doing and have faith that it's all going to work out. So, yeah.
I clenched when you talked about having more ability to be risky. Personally, it's like that's the scariest thing to me ever. So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to talk about how our risk profiles really dictate the decisions we make, and seeking the ability or seeking like outside counsel to understand like how you can manage the feelings around risk.
Yeah, I coach, I do one-on-one performance coaching with people now too. So, I have clients that are stuck in a rut or trying to figure out what to do next with their lives or whatever. But a lot of those discussions around like, well, what if it doesn't work or why is it going to fail? If I just have those people turn a little bit and I say, look at these other areas of your life where you've been successful. You pursued your degree or your graduate degree, or you pursued your career, or you pursued your family or your friendships or your nonprofit work or whatever. I mean, people generally can find a long list of things that they didn't know anything about that once they pursued, they were really successful in. And for some reason, this little thing of entrepreneurship and starting a business seems like the thing that nobody can conquer. And in that case, I say, well, look around at the people who have been successful. I often find that even when I'm having moments of doubt, if I can remind myself that somebody else has done it, then I know it's possible. And when I know it's possible, it takes a little bit of that fear away.
I love it. We have another question. Are there any warnings or words of caution that you can leave a new entrepreneur to help avoid any sinkholes you may have found, or things to stay away from at all costs?
Uh, Bad partners.
Ooh.
Bad partners, and this is another thing I remember talking to my students at MSU about a lot, is just because you and Becky love the same things and the same kind of pizza and the same kind of art and the same kind of music does not mean that you and Becky are going to be perfect business partners. And that's the trap that people fall into. Becky and I both are awesome at graphic design, and we both want to own a business, and we both have Dobermans, and we both, love old movies, right? When you get into a business, it's a lot like a marriage, right? In the sense that when these two people come together, what they really need to do is have differences that fill holes or enhance the shortcomings of their partner, or that really develop and push forward the strengths of their partner. And that rarely happens when two the exact same kind of person get together. And so when I hear people saying, oh, we're exactly alike, this is going to be great, I say, great, well, then your 200% come together and you're still just 100%, because nobody has any different skills, ambitions, or desires. When you're picking a partner, you really need to find people who are different than you, right? Like if you're I'm a vision guy, vision and strategy, right? But I am not what we call an implementer. I do not like the little details, right? I want to tell you what my big vision is, and then I want you to go parse it out and then implement it into my business, because I will blow my brains out if I have to sit there coming up with some kind of report or plan about, what needs to be done when and what it's going to cost. I have no interest in it, right? And so if I had a partner who was exactly like me, well, guess what? That plan never gets implemented, and both of us blow our brains out. So you got to find somebody who complements your strengths and your weaknesses, but has a different orientation towards work and how they think. So if I'm big vision, then I want to find someone who's analytical, right? And then if you have three partners or four partners, it's important to do that. Like, Jameer and Leon and I, my former students who are now some of my best friends in the world, and now we're building a new company, but we all understand what our strengths and weaknesses are and where we're different and what our realm is going to be, right? And there's no expectation that we're all going to do the same things with the same skill set or vigor. And so having a diverse group of founders really, and actually if you go to incubators or you go to these funding things where you can, do your pitch competition and stuff like that, they ask you about your team, and that's what they're looking for. They're looking for diverse backgrounds and diverse interests, because then rather than it being 100%, it's actually 300% value, right? Because you have 300% people doing three different things, and now this thing is going to move 300 times faster and be 300 times more likely to be successful.
I wish I could just multiply myself by 100 every time I'm doing something. I have two more questions for you. We're running to the end of our time, but one of them is from the chat, and it's, how do your childhood situations affect how you contribute to your communities now?
Yeah. I just read this great book called The Second Mountain by David Brooks. And he talks about how, do you know this book? Yeah. He talks about how on our first mountain, we are a little self-serving. We are kind of focused on our career and things that are important to us individually. And then once we have some success or kind of get to the top, a couple things happen. And one of them is you think, is this it? Is this what I signed up for? Did I do all of this just to get here? Because, it turns out that the things that fulfill me personally don't really have as much fulfillment as I get older. And so what he talks about is the second mountain. And as you come into the second mountain of your life, that mountain is really more about service and impact and legacy, whether you believe in legacy or not. And that the joy in your life is now derived from serving people and not so much serving yourself. And so I think I kind of look at myself as an example of that. And I'm fortunate to have had the success that I've had because now I'm in this place where I want to go make other entrepreneurs aware of some of the pitfalls of childhood trauma. I want to make people aware of how short their lives are and how special their lives are through this work with the people who are dying. And I want to pass on my skills and my legacy of business development to my friends who are now taking it on for the first time.
I was so excited because I just read How to Know a Person by David Brooks. He's
Mm,
so insightful, and
yeah.
his stories are always really deep and hard hitting and of life and death, like true,
Mm,
the stuff that's really on the line, right?
yeah.
And so if anyone on the call has not read David Brooks, I urge you to take a look. And we're having an event actually at MSU Denver for a book read about David Brooks. So really appreciate his insight, and he is just an incredible author. Um, I have one last question for you, Travis, and I
Sure.
always feel like I just want to talk to you forever because you're one of the most fascinating people, and just you have so much insight to give. But my last question for you is, what's the most meaningful lesson you've learned about resilience, business, and life?
I get a little emotional. Um, it's pretty simple. You have to have a purpose and a mission, and that will carry you through some really tough times. Um, and when I realized that my purpose and my mission in life was not to make millions of dollars or be on the cover of a magazine, but it was to be the father that I didn't have and to be there for my kids and show them uh, what it looked like to show up. um, my life changed. It did because everything became fun and all that risk aversion stuff that we talk about or that fear about entrepreneurship. It was all worth it because I knew why I was doing it. I was doing it for my sons. And so that has been a really important lesson that I hope other people grasp as they go through this journey or think about this journey is who is it for? Like who do you owe this to, right? And can you find a purpose that's bigger and more important than just like making money? Because that's what will get you through the hard times. So that's probably the most powerful lesson I've learned.
There is no more questions on that. That's it.
That's it.
Um, That's it. I just, God, thank you for being so vulnerable with us. And it's so interesting to hear someone as successful as you are. You're very successful, Travis. And for you to like come full circle to like, I've had successes and failures, and now I just get it that it's about my kids and about being a father. And oh my God, like so beautiful. You're such a beautiful person, Travis. Thank you so much for coming and answering questions and talking to us and
Of course.
informing us with such depth and vulnerability. You're just awesome.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to reach out to me or has more questions, just email me, travis@travisluther.com.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.